The humidity in Savannah doesn't just sit on your skin, it listens. It carries the scent of damp earth and old secrets, things people think they've buried deep enough to forget. I was sitting on my porch, the wicker chair creaking a steady, rhythmic protest, watching a black sedan turn onto my gravel driveway. It was too sleek for this neighborhood, too polished for a street where the oaks grow low and heavy with moss. I didn't stand up. At 72, my bones have earned the right to stay still until they are moved by something truly worth the effort. I simply adjusted my glasses and watched the dust settle. 33 years is a long time to keep a ghost in your pocket. But when the door opened and a woman stepped out, draped in silk that cost more than my first house, her hair a silver crown of precision, I didn't see a stranger. I saw the girl who had walked out of our shared bedroom in 1993 and never looked back. My twin, Wanda. She stood there for a moment, squinting at the peeling paint of my banister, her nose slightly upturned as if the very air of our childhood home was beneath her. She looked like a woman who had won at life. She looked like a woman who had forgotten that every debt eventually comes due, even the ones written in blood. "Sister," she said. The word was thin, brittle. It didn't have the weight of family behind it. It sounded like a transaction. I didn't answer immediately. I took a slow sip of my iced tea, letting the condensation cool my palm. I watched a blue jay land on the fence, its eyes sharp and calculating. Birds understand things humans often ignore. If you want to survive, you have to know exactly when to strike and when to remain perfectly still. "You're late, Wanda," I finally said. My voice was like dry leaves on pavement, quiet, but impossible to ignore. 33 years is quite the detour just to find your way back to the porch. She laughed, a sharp, practiced sound she likely used at cocktail parties in London or Paris. Always the dramatic one, Joyce. "I'm here because I wanted to see you. Is it a crime to visit my only sibling?" She was lying. I could see it in the way her fingers twitched toward her designer handbag, the way her eyes darted toward the mailbox. Wanda never did anything without a motive. In 1993, that motive was a man named Julian and a green-stamped document that belonged to me. She had taken my name, my passport, and my future, leaving me to explain to the authorities why Joyce was suddenly missing while she was boarding a flight to the UK as the bride of a wealthy shipping heir. She thought she had erased me. She thought that by becoming me, she had made me vanish. But she forgot one very important detail about the South: we don't forget, we just wait for the season to change. "Come inside," I said, pushing myself up with a deliberate slowness. "The heat is starting to draw the flies, and I'd hate for you to ruin that expensive silk." As she followed me into the cool, dim hallway of the house we grew up in, she didn't notice that I hadn't locked the door behind her. She didn't notice the way I looked at her, not with anger, but with the cold, clinical focus of a surgeon. She thinks she's here to close a chapter. She doesn't realize she's just walked into the center of a web I've been weaving since the day the plane wheels left the tarmac. The air inside the house always smells of cedar and floor wax, a scent that hasn't changed since our mother passed away. Wanda paused in the foyer, her eyes scanning the faded floral wallpaper as if she were inspecting a museum exhibit of a life she'd narrowly escaped. She looked out of place, a diamond dropped in a bowl of river stones. "It's exactly the same, Joyce," she murmured, her voice trailing off as she touched the edge of a mahogany side table. "How have you stayed here all this time? Don't you find it suffocating?" I walked past her into the kitchen, the linoleum clicking under my sensible shoes. "Consistency isn't suffocation, Wanda. It's a foundation. You spent 30 years building a life on someone else's name. I imagine that feels a bit more precarious than a drafty hallway." She stiffened. The mask of the polished socialite slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the panicked girl who had swapped our passports in the middle of the night. She followed me into the kitchen, her heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm. "Julian is dead," she said abruptly, as if the news were a shield she could hold up against me. He passed 6 months ago. Heart failure. I set 2 mismatched teacups on the table. I didn't offer my condolences. Julian was a man who bought a wife like he bought a cargo ship. He hadn't cared which twin he took, as long as she was beautiful and compliant. Wanda had bet everything on his wealth, and it seemed she'd won the jackpot, or so she wanted me to believe. And yet, here you are, I said, pouring the tea. The steam rose between us, a thin veil of heat. Widowed, wealthy, and suddenly homesick for a sister you left for dead in a legal nightmare. You didn't come here to mourn, Wanda. You came here because Julian's lawyers found something. Or perhaps, they didn't find something they expected to see. She sat down, her movements stiff. She didn't touch the tea. The estate is complicated. There are trust funds, properties in London, a villa in Menton. But Julian was meticulous. He kept records of everything. Even things from before we met. I watched her closely. Her eyes were darting toward my hands, which were steady as I stirred a single spoonful of sugar into my cup. She was looking for a crack, a sign that I was still the fragile girl who had wept at the airport gate while the police questioned my identity. She didn't realize that 3 decades of silence had turned that fragility into something closer to flint. The visa, I said quietly. The one you used to leave. The one with my signature on it. Wanda leaned in, her voice a sharp whisper. The lawyers are auditing the early marriage documents for the inheritance tax. They noticed a discrepancy in the maiden name filings from 33 years ago. If they dig too deep, they'll realize the woman who married Julian isn't the woman on the birth certificate. And then the wealthy widow becomes a fraudulent immigrant, I finished for her. The assets freeze. The titles vanish. And the silk turns back into cotton. She reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly as she tried to cover mine. I didn't move, but I didn't pull away. I let her feel the coldness of my skin. I need you to sign a deposition, Joyce. A simple statement saying there was a clerical error at the embassy. That we swapped names legally as children. It would fix everything. I'll pay you, of course. More than this house is worth. I looked at her, really looked at her. She thought my life had a price tag. She thought 33 years of stolen sunlight could be settled with a check and a lie. She was so focused on the fire in her own backyard that she hadn't noticed I was the one holding the match. I'll think about it, I said, withdrawing my hand to take a slow sip of tea. But first, you're going to stay here. For a week. I want to see if the woman I remember is still under all that French lace. She looked relieved. A fatal mistake. She thought she had negotiated a deal. She didn't realize she had just checked herself into a cage. Wanda's luggage was heavy, for matched cases of Italian leather that looked absurd against the warped floorboards of our upstairs hallway. I led her to the guest room, the one that used to be our mother's. The air there always held a faint, stubborn scent of lavender and mothballs, a fragrance that seemed to make Wanda's shoulders hunch as if she were shrinking back into her childhood skin. It's small, she remarked, her voice echoing in the sparse room. She set her designer handbag on the handmade quilt, a jarring splash of modern vanity on a relic of the past. It's a room, Wanda, I said, leaning against the doorframe. It's 4 walls and a roof. Some people find that a luxury when their entire identity is built on a foundation of sand. She turned to me, her eyes narrowing. The relief from the kitchen was already curdling into irritation. You've become quite cynical, Joyce. Is this what 30 years of consistency does to a person? Or is it just the bitterness of being the one who stayed? I didn't blink. I've spent decades practicing the art of the unreadable face. I didn't stay, Wanda. I was grounded. There's a difference between choosing a port and being chained to the dock because someone stole your sails. She sighed, a long, weary sound, and began to unbutton her silk coat. "I told you, I'll make it right. The money I can transfer to you once this audit is cleared, it's more than you could spend in 3 lifetimes. You could leave this house. You could see the world." "I've seen enough of the world through the newspapers," I replied. "I saw you at the gala in London in '02. I saw you on that yacht in the Mediterranean in '11. You were always very good at being seen, Wanda. But you were never very good at looking." I walked toward the window and pulled the heavy velvet curtain back just a fraction. Down in the garden, the weeds were tall, but beneath them, the perennials were still breathing. I knew exactly where every stone was laid. "While you were busy being Joyce in high society," I continued, "the real Joyce had to learn a different set of skills. I had to learn how to navigate a legal system that thought I was a ghost. I had to learn how to fix a roof, how to stretch a dollar, and how to wait. Waiting is a very quiet skill, Wanda. It's like growing an oak tree. You don't see the movement, but the roots are cracking the pavement beneath you." She stopped moving, her hands frozen on the clasp of her suitcase. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means you're tired," I said, my voice dropping into a soothing, melodic register. "Go to sleep. The guest bed has the same mattress Mother used. It's firm. It remembers the shape of a body." I left her there, the silence of the house closing in around her like a shroud. I went downstairs to the small study behind the kitchen, the room where I keep my files. I don't use a computer, electronics are too easy to track, too easy to erase. I prefer paper. Paper has memory. Paper has weight. I opened a drawer and pulled out a manila folder I hadn't touched in months. Inside were copies of the very documents Wanda was so afraid of. But there was something else, too. A series of letters from a law firm in London, Julian's law firm, dated 3 years ago. Wanda thought the audit was a new development. She thought she was the one bringing the news to my door. She didn't realize that I had been corresponding with Julian's lead counsel for a long, long time. I wasn't just waiting for her to come home, I had practically sent the invitation myself. I turned off the lamp, letting the darkness of the house settle over me. Upstairs, I heard the floorboards groan as Wanda moved toward the bed. She thinks she's here to buy my signature. She doesn't realize that in this house, I am the judge, the jury, and the keeper of the keys. Breakfast was a quiet affair. I had prepared grits, blackened catfish, and coffee, heavy, soul-clinging food that Wanda hadn't touched in decades. She sat across from me, her silk blouse tucked perfectly, looking like a portrait of a woman who had forgotten how to eat with her hands. She picked at the fish with a silver fork she'd brought down from her own travel kit. "You always did like things seasoned until they burned, Joyce," she said, her voice tight. "Julian's chef in London, he used to make things so light. Emulsions. Foams. You could eat a 5-course meal and feel like you'd swallowed a cloud." I took a slow, deliberate bite. "Clouds don't sustain you when the winter comes, Wanda. You need something with weight to hold you to the earth. Especially when the ground starts to shift." She looked up, her eyes sharp. "What is that supposed to mean? You've been speaking in riddles since I got here. If you're angry about the visa, say it. If you want more money, name the price. But don't play these grandmotherly games with me." I set my fork down. The clink against the ceramic was the only sound in the room. "Anger is for the young, sister. It's a fire that burns out too fast. I'm interested in something much more durable than anger. I'm interested in the truth of things." I leaned back, watching a fly buzz against the window screen. "You see, when you took my passport in '93, you didn't just take a name. You took a history. For 33 years, I've had to live as a shadow. I couldn't vote. I couldn't own property in my own name for a decade. I had to bury our mother under a pseudonym because the state thought I was the one living in a manor in Kent. Wanda's face paled. I sent money for the funeral. I sent thousands. You sent a check, I corrected her gently. I needed a sister. You sent a signature. Do you know what happens to a person when they are erased while they are still breathing? They become very observant. They start to notice the things that people who are seen always miss. Joyce, please, she whispered, her composure finally beginning to fray at the edges. I was 22. I wanted a life. Julian was my ticket out. I thought you'd understand. You always loved this house. I thought I was doing us both a favor by leaving it to you. I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile a cat gives a mouse that's finally stopped running. You didn't leave it to me, Wanda. You abandoned it. There's a difference. I stood up and walked to the sideboard, picking up a small, weathered tin. I opened it and pulled out a single, yellowed photograph. I placed it on the table in front of her. It was a photo of us at the airport, minutes before she disappeared. We were wearing identical coats. We looked like two halves of a whole. Do you remember what you whispered to me right before you went through security? I asked. Wanda stared at the photo, her breath hitching. I don't remember. You said, don't worry, B. I'll come back for you. I leaned over her, my shadow falling across her expensive silk. You've been back for 24 hours, and you haven't asked me how I've been once. You've only asked me how I can save you. She pushed the chair back, the screech of wood on linoleum sharp and ugly. I'm going for a walk. I need air. Be careful, I called out as she hurried toward the door. The salt marsh behind the house has changed. The paths aren't where they used to be. You might find yourself sinking before you realize you've stepped off the trail. She didn't answer. The screen door slammed, a hollow, cheap sound. I sat back down and finished my coffee. I wasn't worried about her getting lost. I wanted her to see the land. I wanted her to feel how much she no longer belonged to it. While she was out there trying to find her bearings, I had work to do. I went to the telephone in the hallway, the old rotary kind that requires patience. I dialed a number I had memorized long ago. A man with a thick British accent answered on the third ring. This is Joyce, I said, my voice steady and cool. The guest has arrived. She's exactly as we discussed. It's time to move to the next phase of the audit. There was a pause on the other end, then a low, respectful murmur. As you wish, Ms. Hill. The papers will be served to the Savannah address by tomorrow morning. I hung up. Wanda thought she was the one with the lawyers. She didn't realize that for the last 3 years, Julian's meticulous records had been curated by me. Wanda returned from the marsh with the hem of her silk trousers stained a deep, muddy gray. She looked shaken, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The heat had wilted her composure, leaving her hair damp and clinging to her temples. She looked less like a duchess and more like a woman who had realized the earth didn't recognize her footsteps anymore. The path, it just stops, she panted, leaning against the kitchen doorframe. I used to know every inch of that creek, Joyce. Now it's just salt and sinking sand. I didn't look up from the green beans I was snapping. The rhythmic snap pop was the only pulse in the room. The land moves, Wanda. It's alive. If you don't stay to tend it, it forgets you. It doesn't owe you a clear path just because you remember how it looked 30 years ago. She walked over to the sink, splashing cold water on her face. Her movements were jerky, devoid of the practiced grace she'd arrived with. I saw a man. Down by the old oak. He was wearing a suit, Joyce. In this heat. He looked like he was waiting for someone. I paused, a half-snapped bean in my hand. People are always waiting for something, Wanda. Some wait for a sign. Some wait for a mistake. Did he speak to you? No, she whispered, drying her face with a tea towel that had seen better decades. He just watched me. He had a briefcase. He looked like Julian's people. I went back to my beans. Perhaps he's lost. Or perhaps he's exactly where he's supposed to be. Why don't you go upstairs and change? You're dripping on the floor. She lingered, her eyes fixed on my hands. You're so calm. How can you be so calm when everything is falling apart? If I lose the estate, Joyce, I lose everything. I'll have nothing. No home, no status, no name. You'll have the name Mother gave you, I said softly, looking her in the eye. It's a good name. It served me well enough for 70 years. Why is it suddenly not enough for you? She didn't answer. She turned and fled up the stairs, her footsteps heavy and uneven. I waited until I heard her bedroom door click shut. Then, I reached into the pocket of my apron and pulled out a small, velvet box. I opened it. Inside sat a heavy gold signet ring, Julian's ring. The one he supposedly took to his grave. Julian hadn't been meticulous because he was a businessman. He had been meticulous because he was a terrified man. In the last year of his life, he'd realized the woman he shared a bed with was a stranger. He'd reached out to the only person who could tell him the truth, the woman whose name was on the marriage certificate, but whose face was missing from the wedding photos. We had spoken many times, Julian and I. Not with anger, but with a shared sense of being cheated. He had spent a fortune on a lie, I had spent a lifetime in the cold. We made a pact. He would ensure the truth came out after his death, but only if I promised to deliver the final blow myself. He wanted her to feel the floor drop away, just as he had when he'd looked at our old family photos and realized his wife's ears were shaped differently than the girl in the picture. I closed the box. The audit wasn't just about taxes. It was a scavenger hunt Julian and I had designed together. Every document Wanda signed, every lie she told to fix the situation, was just more evidence for the pile. She thought she was coming here to fix a clerical error. She didn't realize she was actually attending her own legal funeral. I heard a soft knock at the front door. I didn't rush. I wiped my hands on my apron, walked to the door, and opened it. The man in the suit stood there, sweat beading on his forehead but his expression professional. He handed me a thick, blue envelope. For the resident, he said. Thank you, Arthur, I said. Is the car ready? Waiting at the end of the lane, Ms. Hill. Just say the word. I took the envelope and closed the door. This was the moment the trap would spring. Inside were the papers that stripped Joyce Hill Vane of every penny Julian had left behind. According to the new will, the entire estate was to be transferred to the rightful holder of the identity, the woman currently standing in a dusty kitchen in Georgia. I didn't feel joy. I felt a cold, deep satisfaction. I walked to the foot of the stairs. Wanda. I called out. Mail's here. I think it's the solution you've been looking for. I heard her door open. I heard her hurrying down. She wanted the nightmare to end. She didn't realize that for her, the sun was just starting to set. The sound of Wanda's footsteps on the stairs was different this time. It wasn't the confident click of a woman in control, it was the hurried, stumbling gait of someone chasing a ghost. She reached the bottom landing, her eyes fixed on the blue envelope in my hand. In the dim light of the hallway, the paper looked like a bruise. Is that it? She whispered, her voice cracking. The deposition. Did the lawyers send the correction? I held the envelope out, but I didn't let go immediately. I felt the weight of it, the legal density of 33 years of redirected life. It's the conclusion, Wanda. Whether it's the one you want depends on how much you believe your own lies. She snatched it from my fingers. Her manicured nails, slightly chipped now from her trek through the marsh, tore at the heavy seal. I watched her face. It's a fascinating thing to watch a person's world dissolve in real time. First, there is the squint of confusion, then the widening of the pupils as the brain refuses to process the words, and finally, the gray, slack-jawed realization of total defeat. This isn't a correction, she stammered, her knees buckling. She slid down against the floral wallpaper, the very paper she had mocked only yesterday. This is a seizure notice. They've frozen the London accounts. They're questioning the validity of the marriage certificate based on identity inconsistency. I stood over her, my shadow stretching long and thin across the floorboards. Julian was a businessman, Wanda. He didn't like being cheated. And as it turns out, he spent the last 3 years of his life making sure that the woman who sat at his dinner table didn't inherit the empire he built on my name. She looked up at me, her face contorted with a mixture of horror and fury. You spoke to him. You stayed in this rotting house and plotted with my husband. I didn't have to plot, I said, my voice as calm as a Sunday morning. I just had to tell him the truth. I sent him the letters you wrote to Mother before she died, the ones where you bragged about how easy it was to slip into my skin. You were so proud of your performance, Wanda. You forgot that every performance eventually has a closing night. She scrambled to her feet, the papers fluttering to the floor like dying birds. I'll fight it. I have the best lawyers in Europe. You're just an old woman in a backwater town. No one will believe you. The lawyers you're counting on are currently being paid by the estate, I reminded her gently. And the estate now belongs to the legal Joyce Hill. That would be me, Wanda. The woman with the fingerprints that match the original birth records. The woman who never left this backwater town. You're currently a guest in a house owned by the woman you erased. And you're doing so under a name you have no right to use. She lunged toward me, her hands clawing for my throat, but she stopped inches away. It wasn't because of my strength, it was the look in my eyes. I didn't look afraid. I looked expectant. Go ahead, I whispered. Add assault to the list of charges. It will make the transition to the local precinct much smoother. She backed away, gasping, her expensive silk blouse damp with sweat. She looked around the hallway as if seeing the walls for the first time, the peeling paint, the dust motes dancing in the light, the sheer, crushing weight of the past. Where am I supposed to go? She asked, her voice small and hollow. The guest room is still yours for the night, I said, turning back toward the kitchen. But I suggest you start packing. The morning comes very early in Savannah, and I have a long list of things that need to be returned to their rightful owners. I walked away, leaving her standing among the wreckage of her stolen life. I had waited 3 decades for this silence. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply the sound of a balance scale finally leveling out. But the night wasn't over yet. Wanda still had 1 card left to play, and I knew exactly which pocket she was keeping it in. The house grew unnervingly quiet after the sun dipped below the horizon. In the south, the night has a way of amplifying small sounds, the skitter of a beetle, the settling of old timber, the shallow, frantic breathing of a woman who has realized her reflection is a stranger. I sat in my darkened study, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the moss-draped oaks outside. I knew Wanda wasn't sleeping. I could hear her pacing in the room above, a frantic, caged movement that matched the rhythm of my own heartbeat. She was looking for a way out, a loophole, a secret door that didn't exist. She had spent 33 years believing she was the protagonist of a grand adventure, only to find out she was merely a footnote in a story I had been editing since 1993. Around midnight, the pacing stopped. A moment later, the floorboards in the hallway groaned. She was coming down. I didn't turn on the light. I waited. She appeared in the doorway of the study, a pale specter in a silk nightgown that looked like a shroud. She wasn't carrying her luggage. She was carrying a small, silver lighter, Julian's lighter, a gift from a gala in Milan. "You think you've won, don't you, B?" she whispered. Her voice was thin, vibrating with a desperate kind of static. "You think you can just step into my life? You don't know the people I know. You don't know the world I've built. You'd drown in London within a week." "I don't want your life, Wanda," I said, my voice steady in the dark. "I want my own back. There's a difference. I don't need a villa in Menton to know who I am. But you, without that name, without that money, who are you? Just a woman who stole from her sister and has nothing to show for it but a handful of bitter memories." She flicked the lighter. The flame danced in her eyes, orange and hungry. "If I can't have it, neither can you. This house, the records, the letters, it can all go away in a matter of minutes. Fire doesn't care about birth certificates." I didn't move. I didn't even flinch. "Fire is a very loud way to surrender, Wanda. Is that how you want to be remembered? As the woman who burned down her history because she couldn't face the truth?" She stepped closer, the heat of the small flame reaching toward the heavy velvet curtains. "I'm not surrendering. I'm resetting the board." "The board is already gone," I said softly. "The man you saw in the garden earlier. Arthur. He didn't just bring the envelope. He brought a digital recorder. Every word we've spoken since you stepped onto this porch has been uploaded to a server in London. The confession you made in the kitchen, the threats you're making now, they're already in the hands of the authorities." The flame flickered. Her hand began to shake. You're bluffing. You've always been a bore, Joyce. You don't have the imagination for a sting operation." "You underestimated the bore," I replied, standing up slowly. "That was your first mistake in 1993, and it's your last one tonight. You thought I was stagnant because I stayed. You didn't realize that while you were busy being seen, I was busy being certain." I walked toward her, not stopping until the heat of the lighter was inches from my chest. I looked directly into her eyes, the same eyes I see in my own mirror every morning. "Give it to me, Wanda. Don't add arson to a life already built on ashes." For a long minute, we stood there, two versions of the same woman, separated by 33 years of lies. Then, the light in her eyes went out. Not the flame, but the spark of defiance. She clicked the lighter shut and let it fall to the floor. "What now?" she asked, her voice sounding small, like a child lost in the woods. "Now," I said, picking up the silver lighter and tucking it into my pocket, "we wait for the morning. And then, we go to the station. Not for revenge, Wanda. For the record." She turned and walked out of the room, her shoulders slumped, her silk gown trailing in the dust. She looked like a ghost finally realizing it was dead. I sat back down in the dark. The house felt lighter, as if the walls were finally exhaling a breath they'd been holding since the 90s. The trap was closed. The debt was settled. But as I looked out at the dark marsh, I knew that the hardest part wasn't the payback. It was deciding what to do with the silence that followed. The sun rose over the Savannah marsh not with a shout, but with a slow, agonizing bleed of orange and gray. I hadn't slept. At my age, sleep is a luxury you surrender when the work is almost finished. I spent the pre-dawn hours sitting at the heavy oak kitchen table, the blue envelope open before me. Beside it sat a ledger, my own meticulous record of 33 years of survival. Every repair to this house, every tax bill paid under a name that the world thought belonged to a socialite in London, was documented. I had kept the receipts of my own erasure. I heard the floorboards upstairs groan. Wanda was moving. It was a heavy, dragging sound, devoid of the frantic energy from the night before. When she finally appeared in the kitchen doorway, the transformation was jarring. She hadn't put on the silk or the pearls. She was wearing a simple cotton robe she'd found in the back of the guest closet, one of our mother's old things. Without the expensive armor of her, Joyce, persona, she looked fragile, her skin sallow in the morning light. "The coffee is hot," I said, not looking up from my ledger. She sat down heavily, her hands trembling as she reached for a mug. "I dreamed about the airport," she whispered. In the dream, the security guard looked at my passport and then looked at me, and his face turned into yours. He started screaming that I was a ghost. "Dreams have a way of catching up to the truth when the mind is tired, Wanda," I replied. I closed the ledger with a soft, final thud. "Arthur will be here at 8 o'clock. We have an appointment at the Federal Building." She gripped the mug, her knuckles white. "Are you really going to do it? After all these years? You're going to hand me over to the authorities like a common criminal?" "I'm your sister, Joyce. Your twin. You ceased being my sister the moment you signed my name to a marriage license for profit," I said, my voice devoid of heat. "And you aren't a common criminal. You're a very uncommon one. You stole a life. That's a much heavier theft than a car or a diamond." She looked out the window at the moss hanging from the trees. "I thought I was special. Julian made me feel like I was the only woman in the world who mattered. I didn't realize I was just a placeholder for a ghost." "Julian knew," I said. "He knew for years. He didn't tell you because he wanted to see how far you'd go. He was a collector of rare things, Wanda. He realized too late that he'd bought a forgery, and he spent his final years making sure the authentic piece was restored to its proper place." The sound of tires on gravel broke the silence. Arthur's black sedan was pulling up. Wanda flinched, the sound hitting her like a physical blow. She looked at the door, then back at me, a flicker of the old desperation in her eyes. "Is there no other way?" she pleaded. "I'll give you everything. I'll sign over the London house, the accounts, the jewelry, just let me disappear. Let me go to the villa in Menton and live quietly. No one has to know." I stood up and smoothed my apron. "You've spent 33 years disappearing, Wanda. It's time you stayed in one place long enough to be counted." I picked up the blue envelope and the ledger. "Dress yourself. Put on your finest silk. If you're going to face the consequences of your choices, you might as well look like the woman who made them." She stood up, her movements slow and mechanical. She walked toward the stairs, but stopped at the banister. "You're cold, Joyce. You've become like the stone in this house." "Stone doesn't break, Wanda," I called after her. "It just waits for the water to pass over it." As she disappeared upstairs, I went to the front door. Arthur was waiting, his expression as professional as a tombstone. He took my bag and placed it in the trunk. "Is she ready?" he asked. "She's remembering who she is," I said. "It's a painful process. Give her 10 minutes." I looked back at the house, the peeling paint, the sagging porch, the sanctuary that had been my prison and my fortress. Today, for the first time in 3 decades, the door would be locked from the outside by the woman whose name was actually on the deed. The drive from the marsh to the Federal Building in Savannah is usually 20 minutes of oak-lined beauty, but today, the interior of the sedan felt like a pressurized chamber. Arthur drove with a rhythmic, detached precision, his eyes fixed on the road. Wanda sat beside me in the back seat, her silk suit perfectly pressed, her face a mask of expensive cosmetics. But I could smell her fear. It was a sharp, metallic scent that not even the finest French perfume could mask. "You haven't said a word, Joyce," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the passing Spanish moss. "Are you enjoying this? The silent march to the gallows." I smoothed the fabric of my own dress, a simple, charcoal-colored linen. "There is no joy in an audit, Wanda. There is only the settling of accounts. If you feel like you're on a march to the gallows, perhaps it's because you built the platform yourself over the last 30 years. She turned to me then, her eyes flashing with a final, desperate spark of the woman who had conquered London high society. I gave you a life of peace. You stayed in the home you loved, surrounded by memories. I took the burden of Julian's world, the constant scrutiny, the lying. I did the hard work while you sat on a porch. I turned my head slowly to meet her gaze. My eyes have seen more winters than hers, even if we share the same birth date. You didn't take a burden. You took a shortcut. And as for my peace, I spent 3 decades in a legal purgatory where I couldn't even claim my own mother's inheritance because my social security number was being used to open offshore accounts in the Caymans. You didn't give me peace. You gave me a cage made of my own name. She looked away, her jaw tightening. Julian loved me. He wouldn't have done this if he didn't care for me in his own twisted way. Julian loved the idea of the woman you pretended to be, I corrected her. The moment he realized the woman in his bed was a thief who had abandoned her own flesh and blood for a bank balance, his love turned into a very specific kind of ledger. He spent his final year meticulously unweaving the tapestry you spent a lifetime knitting. Arthur slowed the car as we approached the downtown district. The grand, gray stone of the federal building loomed ahead, a monument to the very things Wanda had spent her life evading: record, law, and consequence. They won't just take the money, will they? She asked, her voice dropping to a jagged whisper. They will take the identity, I said. By the time we walk out of those doors, Joyce Hill Vane will cease to exist. The assets will be moved to the estate of the rightful Joyce. You will be left with the name our mother gave you, Wanda. A woman with no credit history, no legal residency in the UK, and 33 years of unexplained gaps in her tax filings. The car came to a smooth halt at the curb. Arthur stepped out and opened the door. The humid savannah air rushed in, heavy with the scent of river water and old stone. One last thing, Wanda, I said as she prepared to step out. When we get inside, don't try to lie. I've already provided the original 1993 flight manifests and the witness statements from the airport staff who remembered the distraught sister left behind. The truth is already in the room. You're just here to sign the confession. She stepped out onto the pavement, her heels clicking a hollow, defeated rhythm on the concrete. She looked up at the massive columns of the building, her shoulders finally dropping. The Duchess was gone. The widow was gone. There was only a tired woman in a stained silk suit, standing in the shadow of a debt she could never repay. Walk straight, I told her, stepping out beside her. Don't look like a victim. Look like a woman who is finally paying what she owes. It's the most honest thing you've done since the 90s. As we climbed the stone steps, I felt a strange, light sensation in my chest. The weight was shifting. The ghost was finally moving into the light. The interior of the federal building felt like a cathedral built of cold marble and bureaucratic indifference. Our footsteps echoed, mine steady and grounded, Wanda's sharp and uneven, as we were led into a private conference room on the 4th floor. There was no mahogany furniture here, no silk drapes like the ones she was used to in London. Just a long laminate table, a stack of recording equipment, and 3 people who looked like they hadn't smiled since the mid-90s. At the head of the table sat a woman in a charcoal suit, her hair pulled back in a knot so tight it seemed to pull the skin of her forehead. "Miss Hill," she said, looking at me. Then, her gaze shifted to Wanda with a clinical lack of warmth. "And, the respondent." Wanda flinched at the word. Respondent. It was a legal term for a ghost. "Sit down, Wanda," I said softly, taking my place at the center of the table. I pulled the old family Bible out of my bag, the one with the birth records tucked into the middle, and placed it on the table. It looked ancient and heavy against the sterile white of the room. The official, a special agent named Miller, cleared her throat. "We have reviewed the documents provided by the estate of Julian Vane, as well as the 1993 affidavits filed in the state of Georgia. The discrepancy is no longer a matter of a clerical error, as was suggested in previous filings. She looked directly at Wanda. "Ma'am, do you wish to make a formal statement regarding the identity you have used for the past 33 years? Wanda opened her mouth, but for the first time in her life, the charm failed her. No witty retort came out. No socialite poise could bridge the gap between the truth and the ledger. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for a reprieve I had no intention of giving. I did what I had to do," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "Julian wanted a wife who was unencumbered. Joyce loved the house. I thought it was a fair trade." "A fair trade?" Agent Miller repeated, her pen hovering over a notepad. "You took a federal identity. You used a stolen passport to enter the United Kingdom. You signed legal contracts, marriage licenses, and tax returns under a name that was not your own. In the eyes of the law, Wanda, you have spent 3 decades committed to a singular, continuous act of fraud." "But the money," Wanda started, her hand twitching toward her handbag. "The money is currently in probate," I interrupted, my voice calm and resonant. "And as the rightful Joyce Hill, I have already signed the directives. The accounts in London and the villa in Menton are being liquidated to settle the back taxes and the legal fees incurred by my absence from the system." Wanda's face went white. "Liquidated? Joyce, that's my life. That's everything I built." "You didn't build it, Wanda," I said, leaning forward. "You stole the blueprints. You lived in a house built on my foundation, and you never even checked to see if the roof was leaking. While you were hosting parties in Kent, I was working 2 jobs to pay off the debts you left behind in Savannah under my name. You didn't just take my future, you poisoned my past." Agent Miller pushed a thick stack of papers toward Wanda. "This is a voluntary surrender of all claims to the Vane estate and an admission of identity theft. If you sign this, the Department of Justice will recommend a suspended sentence based on your cooperation and your age. If you don't, we move to formal prosecution for international fraud." The room went silent. I watched Wanda stare at the pen. It was a simple plastic ballpoint, but in this moment, it was heavier than all the gold she had ever worn. She looked at the Bible on the table, then back at me. "You planned this," she hissed, a final flicker of venom in her eyes. "From the moment Julian contacted you. You didn't want the money. You wanted to watch me sign my own death warrant." "I wanted the balance restored," I replied. "Money is just paper, Wanda. But a name? A name is the only thing you take with you when you leave this world. I'm just making sure you leave with the one you started with." With a trembling hand, Wanda picked up the pen. The scratch of her signature on the paper sounded like a long, slow exhale. 33 years of Joyce Hill Vane vanished in a streak of black ink. As she finished the last page, she slumped back in her chair, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. She was no longer a duchess. She was just Wanda. A woman with no assets, no status, and a very long bus ride back to a house she no longer owned. The drive back to the marsh was conducted in a silence so thick it felt like the fog rolling off the Savannah River. Wanda sat pressed against the far door of the sedan, staring out at the passing trees as if they were bars on a cell. She had signed away the villas, the yachts, and the name that had been her armor for half a lifetime. She was stripped down to the marrow, and for the first time in 33 years, she was just a woman sitting in the heat of a Georgia afternoon. When Arthur pulled the car onto the gravel driveway of our childhood home, the house seemed to lean toward us, expectant. The peeling white paint and the sagging porch didn't look like poverty anymore, they looked like a reckoning. "We're here," I said, my voice cutting through the hum of the air conditioning. Wanda didn't move. "I have nothing, Joyce. No bank account. No passport. Even the clothes on my back are technically yours now," aren't they? Since they were bought with Julian's money, your money. I don't want your silk, Wanda, I said, opening my door. I've spent 30 years in cotton and linen. I know the value of things that don't tear when you snag them on a bramble. Come inside. There's one last thing you need to see. She followed me, her steps heavy, her expensive heels sinking into the dirt she had spent a lifetime trying to wash off her feet. We walked through the foyer and into the small study where I had spent so many nights corresponding with Julian's lawyers. On the desk sat a single, weathered wooden box. It had belonged to our father, a man who worked the docks until his back gave out, leaving us with nothing but a patch of land and a reputation for honesty. You always hated this box, I whispered, running my fingers over the scarred wood. You said it smelled like old tobacco and failure. You wanted the velvet jewelry boxes of Europe. You wanted things that sparkled so brightly you wouldn't have to look at the shadows. I opened the lid. Inside wasn't gold or documents. It was filled with soil, dark, rich Georgia earth. This is your inheritance, Wanda, I said. The land you abandoned. The roots you tried to cut. You thought you were escaping a small life, but you were actually escaping the only thing that was real. Wanda looked at the dirt, her lip curling in a ghost of her former disdain. You brought me all the way back here, for a box of mud? To gloat? No, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous chill. I brought you here to show you what happens when you try to transplant a tree without its roots. It withers. It becomes a hollow shell that looks alive but crumbles the moment the wind picks up. I reached into the box and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, the original deed to the house. I placed it on the desk between us. The audit is finished. The state recognizes me as the owner of this property and all the assets attached to the name, Joyce Hill. But there is a small clause in Julian's revised will, one I suggested myself during our last phone call before he passed. Wanda's eyes sharpened, a flicker of the old greed returning to her gaze. A clause. About what? About your future, I said. Julian didn't want you on the streets, despite everything. He wanted you to have exactly what you deserved. He left a modest trust, enough for a small apartment in town and a quiet life. But there's a condition. She leaned in, her breath hitching. What condition? You have to live under your own name, I said. Every check you cash, every lease you sign, every person you meet, you must introduce yourself as Wanda Hill. The woman who stayed behind. The woman who doesn't exist in the social registers of London. She recoiled as if I'd slapped her. You want me to be a nobody? In the very town where everyone remembers what I did. I want you to be yourself, I corrected her. If that feels like being a nobody, then you've truly spent 30 years becoming nothing at all. I walked to the window and looked out at the marsh. The tide was coming in, the salt water reclaiming the mud flats. It was inevitable. It was clean. You can stay here tonight, I said, not turning around. But tomorrow, Arthur will take you to your new apartment. It's small. It has a view of the docks where Father worked. You'll have a roof and a bed. But you won't have my name. Never again. The silence that followed was the heaviest one yet. I heard her sob, a dry, hacking sound that had no grace in it. She wasn't crying for the sister she'd betrayed, she was crying for the reflection she'd lost. I didn't comfort her. Some debts are paid in cash, and some are paid in the slow, agonizing realization of who you really are when the lights go out. But as the sun began to set, I knew there was one final movement in this symphony. A detail Wanda had overlooked, a small oversight that would ensure she never, ever forgot the cost of a stolen life. The next morning, the savannah air was thick and still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I stood on the porch, watching Arthur load Wanda's 4 Italian leather suitcases into the trunk of the sedan. They looked smaller now, their designer logos dull under the relentless southern sun. Wanda stood at the top of the stairs, her hand gripping the banister as if it were the only thing keeping her from floating away into the heat. "This is it, then," she said, her voice a hollow rasp. "The great Joyce Hill, finally in her castle, while I'm sent to a tenement by the docks." I didn't look at her. I looked at the horizon, where the marsh met the sky in a blurred line of green and gray. "It's not a tenement, Wanda. It's a clean apartment. It's more than most people get when they've spent 30 years living a lie. It's a chance to be honest. That's a luxury you haven't afforded yourself since we were girls." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "Honesty? In a town that remembers me as the girl who vanished. I'll be a pariah. A ghost in a house of ghosts." "You were always a ghost, Wanda," I said, finally turning to face her. My expression was as calm as the water in the creek. "You just had better clothes before. Now, you're just a woman. And being a woman is a heavy enough burden without carrying a stolen name." I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a silk handkerchief. I walked over to her and pressed it into her hand. Her fingers instinctively closed around it. "What is this?" she whispered. "Open it," I said. She unwrapped the silk. Inside lay a small, tarnished brass key. It wasn't the key to the apartment or the house. It was the key to our mother's old sewing box, the one Wanda had tried to take with her in 1993 but had dropped in her haste to reach the airport. "Inside that box," I continued, my voice low and steady, "is a letter Mother wrote the night before she died. She knew, Wanda. She always knew. She didn't say anything because she didn't want to destroy the life you'd built, but she left a record. She left the truth." Wanda's face crumpled. The last of her poise evaporated, leaving only the raw, jagged edges of a woman who had realized her greatest secret was never a secret at all. She knew. And she still loved me. She loved the daughter she lost, I said. But she respected the daughter who stayed. "That letter is yours now. It's the only thing in this world that belongs to Wanda Hill. Read it. Keep it. Let it be the foundation of whatever life you have left." I stepped back, putting the width of the porch between us. "Arthur is waiting." She stared at the key for a long moment, then tucked it into her pocket. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't look back. She walked down the steps, her movements stiff and mechanical, and slid into the back of the car. As the sedan pulled away, the gravel crunching under the tires, I felt a peculiar sensation. It wasn't the fiery heat of revenge or the cold weight of malice. It was the simple, profound peace of a closed ledger. I walked back into the house, my house. The rooms felt larger, the air clearer. I went to the kitchen and began to wash the breakfast dishes, the rhythmic sound of the water a soothing melody. I didn't need the villas in France or the accounts in London. I had my name. I had my history. And I had the quiet, unwavering knowledge that in the end, the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs to wait. The sun climbed higher, casting long, sharp shadows across the floorboards. I sat down in my wicker chair on the porch, a fresh glass of iced tea in my hand. The debt was settled. The balance was restored. And for the first time in 33 years, I wasn't waiting for anything at all. The marsh continued to breathe, the tide coming in and going out, indifferent to the dramas of women and their names. But as I watched a heron take flight over the water, I knew one thing for certain: some people spend their lives trying to fly away from the earth, only to realize that the earth is the only thing that ever truly held them. I am Joyce Hill. And that is finally enough. As the dust from her car settled, I went back into the house and opened the sewing box one last time. I looked at the letter I told Wanda was from our mother. I lied. Mother didn't leave a letter. She died calling out for the daughter who wasn't there. The paper inside that box was blank, as empty as the life Wanda is about to live. But she'll spend the rest of her days staring at those blank pages, searching for a forgiveness that doesn't exist. You see, revenge isn't about the noise you make. It's about the silence you leave behind. I have my name back. And Wanda? She has a key to a box full of nothing. If you realized the moment I stopped being the victim and started being the architect, leave a comment. Most people would have shouted. I chose to wait 33 years. If you believe some debts can only be paid in time, subscribe to Old School Payback.